Welcome to the Risk Management Chapter 9 lecture. I am Dr. Bill Perkins, and today's lecture stems from the material taken from our textbook, Business Continuity and Risk Management, Essentials of Organizational Resilience by Kurt J. Engemann and Douglas M. Henderson. So in Chapter 9, we'll be covering enhancing coordination with external agencies, and we're going to get started here. So let's go over the chapter objectives. First, we're going to identify external resources available throughout the phases of emergency management. Then we're going to review the importance of having relationships with outside agencies and partners. Then we're going to identify opportunities to develop relationships during mitigation and preparedness phases. Now, business continuity management cannot stand alone if it is to be successful. Coordination with external agencies that can bring additional resources helps ensure that BCM is best situated to respond and recover from an emergency that impacts business operations in the community. Now, the key to coordination between BCM and the resources of government agencies, non-government organizations, or NGOs, we'll address them later in the chapter, and businesses that are critical to the implementation of business continuity is the relationships with these organizations. So external relationships is the management of relationships with external agencies for the incorporation of their resources into the BCM. Now, external resources may be people or materials such as equipment or supplies or they may be policies, guidelines, best practices, or other tools developed by others in BCM and related fields. So resources are available to augment BCM from all levels of government, from the agencies active in your state under the National Response Framework, the NRF, to the local building code enforcement agency, from the nonprofit agencies such as the Red Cross, and from businesses and corporations that rely on BCM every day, such as utility companies and insurance companies. They also have an impact on BCM just about every day. So this chapter will focus on the relationships every business planner should have with state and local government agencies and non-government organizations and how to build them throughout the 4 phases of emergency management, which are mitigation, preparedness, response, and recovery. So by knowing what these partners bring to the table, you will be able to understand which agencies in a community can provide the resources necessary to successfully augment your BCM. Knowing what resources are available to your business and how to access them during times of an emergency is key to continuity of operations and business recovery plans, as it is the recovery assistance available to the community, employees, their families, and their property. Now, an important factor for the recovery of normal business operations is the ability of employees to access recovery assistance for their families and homes. Now, the 4 phases of emergency management are viewed in a circle. However, the phases are overlapping, not separate and distinct, as are relationships developed to enhance the BCM. The intervening moment to this idea of a cycle flows occurs when a disaster happens and focus must shift to response and recovery operations. Now, for this reason, mitigation and preparedness are sometimes referred to as peacetime phases, distinctive from more chaotic atmosphere during the disaster phases of response and recovery. So remember that for a large organization, activities at some locations could be focused on response or recovery, while at other sites the focus is on mitigation and preparedness activities, either because the disaster has not had an impact or has not yet had an impact, or the impact has already been remediated. And at these times, BCM is engaged in all 4 phases simultaneously and activities at a single location could have a dramatic impact on other locations' activities. Now, because the phases overlap and because activities in one phase have an impact on phases that follow, it is important to focus on relationship development during all four phases. However, due to the contrasting atmosphere between the peacetime and disaster phases, it is recognized that relationships are best developed during the mitigation phases. Although it is possible to build relationships during the organized chaos of response, it is not ideal to do so. In addition, business continuity management is responsible for moving operations, but only from peacetime activities to response and recovery when a disaster happens, but also for transitioning back to mitigation and preparedness activities focused on the next possible or even impending event. Now, the primary activities of BCM during the preparedness phase are planning, training, and exercise in the program, identifying available resources and establishing communications for the mobilization of these resources is also part of preparedness. Resources that are capable of meeting an emergency need and able to be deployed are said to be ready, and readiness is a measure factor for both human and material resources and should be tested during drills, functionality, and during full-scale exercises, or functional exercises and full-scale exercises. Now, once available resources are identified and ready, part of BCM is to identify assets likely to be needed from the external resources during the response and recovery phases. So, identifying these resources and forming relationships for their mobilization is necessary if business continuity management expects to rely upon them as part of a response and recovery operation. Now, opportunities to find the right resources can be found through local emergency management, regulatory agencies, and not for profit agencies involved in disaster response, as well as through networking groups for business continuity, disaster recovery, and emergency management practitioners. Other relationships are already part of the company's day to day business and need only to be accessed as part of business continuity management. So, forming relationships during the mitigation and preparedness phases is critical to response and recovery success. What has become an emergency management proverb rings true for business continuity professionals. During the disaster is not the time to be exchanging business cards. The resources that you identify and work with during mitigation and planning activities are the people and organizations that will be active during response and recovery operations. So, mitigation and preparedness are tied together in that these are peacetime phases before or after an incident impacts a community. Also, many of the objectives of mitigation planning can be accomplished by preparedness planning. For example, both phases begin with an identification of the hazards facing the community and the likely impact from these hazards. Emergency management agencies and other external agencies developing continuity of operations and emergency response plans may have valuable information collected that could augment risk analysis or risk assessment and business impact analysis. Also, proper training during the preparedness phase, for example, in evacuation and safety protocols, that will lessen the impact of a disaster and make recovery easier and less expensive, which are the goals of mitigation. Identifying available resources to implement both mitigation and preparedness activities will often identify many of the same organizations and people. So, in turn, these will be the same people and organizations active during the response and recovery phases. So, working with these agencies to achieve mitigation and preparedness success for BCM will create relationships that will make response and recovery protocols easier to implement under the National Incident Management NIMS and Incident Command System ICS. So the preparedness phases, like the mitigation phase, it's based on the expectation that response and recovery operations will take place at some point. So training exercises, plans, protocols, and the readiness of material and human resources are all based on response scenarios. So relationship building and defining and understanding the expectations and abilities of all organizations active during response and recovery before it happens are key to success during those phases for business continuity management. Now, understanding not only how external resources will directly impact business continuity, but how external agencies will support employees and the community during response and recovery of a community-wide crisis, that will also impact business resumption. So, following a crisis response and recovery operation or an exercise simulating these actions is the best time to initiate or reignite the achievement of important mitigation and preparedness goals. The interest in initiating change most readily occurs in the immediate post disaster time period. People are more interested in taking actions to be better prepared for the next time, and decision makers are more likely to commit funding after experiencing an impact from a disaster. So you think about what's happening with COVID-19 response, and crisis management right now with the pandemic operations. It'd be a lot easier, and it would definitely be striking while the iron's hot to approach your organization and leadership with some risk management opportunities, and actually spend some of the budget on mitigation. If this were to ever, something similar to this were ever resurface again, you definitely would get more buy-in from your organizational leadership. Now, BCM can initiate the move from response to recovery to mitigation, response and recovery to mitigation and preparedness by reviewing the recent occurrences of those phases. It is important to discuss actions taken and anticipated and actual results of the response and recovery phases in an after action review. Now, documentation of these considerations, along with action items for improvement, should be published in an after action report. That would normally contain your lessons learned and an improvement plan, what to do better for next time. So by including an improvement plan along with the after action report, BCM can identify actions to take, plans to develop, and relationships to build throughout the 4 phases of emergency management as the cycle begins again. So by looking forward, a company will move from being primarily in the recovery phase to being back into the mitigation and preparedness phases. Of course, ongoing recovery of normal business practices, employee well-being, and community recovery may continue for longer periods of time, even while the focus of BCM is on the time. So in some circumstances, BCM will be interfacing with government, non-government, and business organizations with whom there is already some level of relationship within the company due to regulatory, financial, or community obligations. And some of these relationships include fire, police, EMS, and local authorities that inspect and respond to alarms, fire, police, and EMS volunteer units with which the company employees are affiliated, security companies that provide alarm system monitoring or personnel, safety companies that provide alarm and fire suppression systems. And we're going to continue with regulatory agencies for hazardous material and employee safety compliance, insurance companies which protect the business and provide risk management resources, and then you have health insurance providers with an employee assistance program, otherwise known as the acronym EAP, and other benefits. Next, you have the Red Cross, American Red Cross, which provides health and safety training to employees such as first aid, cardiopulmonary resuscitation, which is known as CPR, and workplace safety courses. Then you have your utility companies and contractors that are responsible for recovery activities. And then you have community based organizations and faith based organizations, which the company supports as a donor or for which employees volunteer either on their own or through corporate activities. Now, knowing what interactions already exist and who the company holds these relationships will have a positive impact when approaching these organizations as part of your BCM initiatives. A survey of employees and on site personnel to identify who has training in areas such as first aid, CPR, and who may be a trained firefighter or an emergency medical technician, a Red Cross volunteer, or other emergency personnel in the community is one way to gain this information if it is not already documented in other places within the company. So many states and local jurisdictions are actively entering into public and private partnerships to improve their capabilities in emergency management. Some states have an emergency support function, which is known as an ESF, for business and industry. Some include the private sector in exercises and participate in private sector exercises. And some communities have created online registries of business resources that are available to public sector responders. Now, according to FEMA, the operational concept for for incident management involving the private sector is the concept specified in the National Response Framework, the NRF, and the National Incident Management System, which is NIMS. Now, response organizations at all levels should facilitate coordination with the private sector when first you have determining the impact of an incident. Next, you have maintaining situational awareness or SA across sectors. Next, you have setting priorities for incident management support and response. Then you have determining appropriate recovery and reconstitution measures, particularly in cases where they may result in liability or indemnity, business losses for the private sector. And finally, you have obtaining goods and services necessary for the recovery and restoration of critical infrastructure and key resources, or the acronym CIKR, and other elements of the economy on a priority basis. The one goal of NIMS is to ensure the integration of emergency response plans from the local level up through the states and including federal support as outlined in the NRF. So local planning at the county and municipal level should include private sector coordination in their comprehensive emergency management plan, which is your CEMPS, okay, your SIMPS. Now, during the response phase, emergency operations centers, EOCs, should include representatives from the private sector, including industry. Therefore, it is critical that the BCM include coordination with local emergency management agencies and ensure that emergency plans are coordinated. Now, being part of exercises that test the CEMP and including emergency management and exercises that test business continuity management are two ways to accomplish this objective. Exercises test and identify gaps in emergency plans before an emergency occurs, and by working the emergency management personnel before an emergency occurs, business and emergency management can ascertain what assistance may be necessary and how they can help each other. Providing assistance, particularly with non-essential employees and volunteers, to support emergency management during an emergency and throughout the recovery process can provide many benefits to the business and BCM. So coordinating between a jurisdiction's comprehensive emergency management plan, that's CEMP, CEMP, and the BCM can begin with risk assessment and business impact analysis. And then your EMAs gather information and conduct hazard analysis much the same way as is necessary to complete these management reports for BCM. So in a CEMP, CEMP, the segment may be called a hazard vulnerability analysis or have similar designation. A jurisdiction's mitigation plan required to receive certain funding will also have this information and analysis. A jurisdiction's CEMP and mitigation plans can provide information to BCM, such as designations of critical infrastructure and key resources, which is known as the acronym CIKR, and changes to the community that may be forthcoming, and other agencies, NGOs, and businesses that are active in emergency management planning with the community. So local emergency planning committees, or LEPCs, have arisen in local jurisdictions from hazardous materials and hazardous waste handling regulations. So these entities may sit at the municipal, county, or regional level and are focused on response procedures for all entities that could be activated during an emergency in the community. Now, LEPCs are composed of emergency management, first responders, including police, fire, and emergency medical services, public works, environmental protection, public health, hazmat, and others that would respond to a hazardous materials release. Now, representatives from businesses in the community that may manufacture, store, or transport hazardous materials or waste may also be part of the LEPC. Many LEPCs today, which are your local emergency planning committees, they focus beyond simple hazardous material responses and address issues such as natural and man-made disasters, including terrorist events, which could have an impact on critical infrastructure and key resources, and it may only relate to hazardous material releases indirectly. LEPCs are a great way to build relationships with local regulators and responders, to learn about laws impacting businesses in the community, to understand hazards and risks in the community, and to have a voice in mitigation, preparedness, response and recovery plans, and projects by the government and other businesses that could impact business continuity management. So when disasters strike a community, a large portion of the relief provided is through the work of volunteers and through donations of money, goods, and services. So your charitable organizations that utilize these resources are often referred to as voluntary agencies, which are VOLAGs, VOLAGS is the acronym, or NGOs, meaning organizations. We kind of addressed them earlier. Because the recovery of a company's employees and their families is crucial to returning business operations to normal, knowing which agencies are providing disaster relief services in an impacted community is necessary to business continuity management. Now, national voluntary organizations active in disaster. Let me say that again. National voluntary organizations active in disaster is known as the acronym VOAD. Points of light and hands-on networks are NGOs that coordinate relief efforts and capabilities of other voluntary agencies. Okay, so it's pretty much a hands-on network. These groups include within their system agencies that have a disaster mission throughout the 4 phases of emergency management, such as the American Red Cross, as well as those agencies whose focus may shift to response and recovery operations when resources are needed. So becoming familiar with which agencies are members of coordinating organizations, providing opportunities for employees to learn how they can get involved with voluntary agencies before a disaster strikes, and what services are available through charitable organizations when disasters do impact a community are all ways to augment business continuity management, as in partnering with organizations such as the American Red Cross and VOAD. Now, the American Red Cross is a non government organization, NGO, that is part of the International Red Cross movement and has congressional charter to operate within the United States as an independent, non for profit agency. The American Red Cross mission extends throughout the 4 phases of emergency management, helping people preventing and preparing for and responding to emergencies. Um, the American Red Cross has a large disaster relief program active in chapters throughout the U.S. And it is also has preparedness programs for families, individuals, and businesses. So, a group dedicated to organizing charitable organizations who respond to disasters is called the National Voluntary Organization Active in Disasters, the NVOAD or VOAD. And your VOAD coordination also occurs at the state level and local level. So, by being a participant in VOAD, charitable organizations can ensure their resources are put to the best use during a response, and spontaneous volunteers and donors that best fit their mission can contribute to their activities. Now, VOAD includes non government organizations that provide disaster relief on a regular basis, such as the American Red Cross, the Salvation Army, and Catholic Charities, as well as other charitable organizations that provide social services on a regular basis and make their services available to those impacted by a disaster during response and recovery operations in the community. Now, among the NGOs are 2 segments which participate in VOAD that may or not typically provide social services on a normal basis that can have a positive impact during a disaster. And that's your faith-based organizations, your FBOs, and your community-based organizations, your CBOs. So your faith-based organizations are churches, mosques, synagogues, and other religious institutions which are central to a community's identity and seek to participate in disaster response and recovery activities. And then your FBOs have access to large numbers of volunteers through their memberships. Then your CBOs are advocacy groups that provide representation and sometimes services to particular segments of the community. Your CBOs may or may not be voluntary agencies, usually with small staffs that expand their services to people impacted by a disaster that might not otherwise get help by their agency. So supporting VOAD, there are member agencies and other non-government organizations that provide disaster assistance can augment business continuity management due to their breadth of resources. Steering company philanthropy to these organizations, as well as volunteers, helps assure that the community will recover after a disaster impacts it. So, just as it is important to form relationships with emergency managers and first responders, it is important to form relationships with other business continuity practitioners. And some of these networking opportunities can take many forms, but each has a similar advantage. So it keeps you up to date with current trends and regulations in the field. You get to share your best practices and lessons learned, and then you meet vendors of business continuity and disaster recovery tools and resources. And perhaps more importantly, you form relationships with emergency management, business continuity, disaster recovery, disaster preparedness, and relief agency professionals. Networking opportunities can include trade associations and educational groups, conferences, and online forums. So, your trade associations have different missions, membership, and organizational structures. They may define themselves as networking groups, educational groups, or lobbying groups. Ultimately, business continuity or disaster recovery trade associations have as their goal the promotion of the field and the opportunity to network and learn from fellow practitioners and those that have an impact on its work, such as emergency management, vendors, partners, and clients. Two of the most well-known and respected such groups in the U.S. are the Association of Contingency Planners, which is known as the acronym ACP, and the Contingency Planning Exchange, which is known as CPE. Now, the Association of Contingency Planners, ACP, has 44 chapters in the United States. Each chapter has their own membership rate structure, schedule of presentations, and networking opportunities. ACP's stated mission is to provide a powerful network for the advancement of the industry and the development of business continuity professionals. According to their website, the benefits of joining ACP include opportunities to share knowledge with and gain insight from a network of industry practitioners, and to expand your skills through an extensive knowledge base of resources. So, continuing with the opportunities under ACP, you can earn professional education credits for membership and meeting attendance. You can advance your career through increased visibility and leadership opportunities. And then you can receive discounts on conference products, services, and training. The Contingency Planning Exchange, the CPE, has chapters in and around New York City and in Washington, D.C., with the breadth of businesses and business continuity practitioners in those areas that bring their expertise and experience to CPE meetings and roundtables. CPE attracts members from up and down the East Coast. So CPE's website also includes a members-only area, which allows new members to catch up on past meeting topics and for members to share their best practices, their lessons learned, and presentation topics, giving CPE all the advantages of educational and networking groups and online forums. So, according to its website, Contingency Planning Exchange, the CPE strives to provide its members with ideas and resources to continually enhance business continuity, disaster recovery, and crisis emergency management strategies and tools through high-profile education plans and by encouraging relationships with peers and working with government to promote public/private sector interaction. So, to find a local trade association for a chapter, a targeted online search may be the best route. So, CPE's URL is on this page right down there at the bottom if you want to make a note of it and visit the site. Now, there are many conferences available for business continuity, disaster recovery, and emergency management practitioners. Conferences can last from one day to a full week and often include additional pre or post conference training sessions available to registrants. Conferences typically invite top experts from various fields to discuss important updates and features of business continuity management. Breakout sessions often focus on more specific areas of practice and allow more intimate setting for learning about new techniques, models, practices, and equipment. So the Disaster Resource Guide maintains an annually updated list of worldwide conferences that includes contact links. So there are a number of online forums and list servers available to business continuity, disaster recovery, and emergency management personnel. Forums and list servers allow members via email and websites to post questions, comments, articles, and items for discussion, and to get feedback. So these virtual conversations are often driven by leaders in the field, and they can provide good information for new as well as experienced practitioners. Best practices, new ideas, and debate can all be found in on these online forums and list servers. Yahoo Groups and the International Association of Emergency Managers are two of the most well-known sources for these opportunities. Typically, membership is free. However, sometimes a screening process is employed by the network controllers just to make sure that you are credible. The allhands.net network and the emergency management discussion list together form a growing online community for business continuity, disaster recovery, and emergency management professionals. So utilizing these resources provides practitioners with easy access to relevant news, important updates for the field, and a growing network of subject matter experts, products, service providers, and practitioners to augment business continuity management. So businesses that corporations rely on every day, such as utility companies and insurance companies, can provide valuable external resources to business continuity management. You have your alarm, security, and safety supply companies. All likely have programs or ideas to strengthen mitigation, preparedness, response, and recovery plans and resources. And then you have insurance companies often have risk management programs available to their customers to identify and mitigate risk and negative consequences to business operations, facilities, and employees. So, like the resources available from regulatory agencies, insurance programs may take the form of audits conducted by experts hired by the insurance company or self assessment tools that a company can utilize independently to assess strengths and shortfalls. So it's not just insurance companies providing risk management coverage, but also health insurance providers that can be incorporated into the business continuity management. Health insurance coverage often includes employee assistance programs, your EAPs, and wellness programs. So an EAP typically has resources for mental health, legal, and other advisors available to members who, after disaster impacts a community, could play a vital part in the recovery process for employees and their families. Now, these resources should be included as part of a company's disaster assistance program. Then you have your wellness programs. They're designed to get employees healthier and safer. Um, it may provide training such as first aid, CPR, and AED, but may also include recovery programs for employees after a disaster. So remember that the sooner employees and their families return to their normal lives, the sooner the business operations can return to its normal state as well. Now, utility companies are another type of business where it is beneficial to have relationships with their representatives during response and recovery operations. Utility companies will typically have their own external affairs, government affairs, and emergency management personnel, all of whom are good people to know as part of business continuity management. Utility companies will often have a liaison in municipal or county EOCs. Now, these representatives will be accessing and providing damage assessment and recovery information. So, priorities for the recovery of utility system services will depend on the number of customers affected and the proximity to critical infrastructure and key resources in the impacted area. Having a relationship with a utility company representative can help to ensure a quicker return to service than those who do not. At a minimum, know how local providers tally outage areas and the way they rely on customers to report occurrences. Ensure that reporting an outage is a priority of response and recovery operations, and how to do so is addressed in your business continuity plan. And that concludes our Chapter 9 lecture. Just make sure you visit Blackboard for this chapter's expectations and deliverables, and I will see you in Chapter 10.